In this particular session, we are going to study about pollination. What is pollination, how it actually occurs, and its types also. Before going to all these things, I want to recap some of our previous classes topic. That means in our previous classes, we already studied that a flower, that means a typical flower is consist of four holes. One is your calyx, another one is your corolla, next one is your androecium, and last one is your gynoecium. Among these four holes, calyx and corolla both are your accessory holes, and androecium and gynoecium both are your reproductive holes. So your male reproductive hole is otherwise known as your androecium, and female reproductive hole is otherwise known as your gynoecium. So you all know about your androecium and gynoecium, and that means your male reproductive hole and female reproductive hole. So in this session, we just discuss about these two, that means among these two. That means in pollination, that means the simple term pollination told you that the transfer of your pollen grains from the anther to the stigma is otherwise known as your pollination. That means the simple transformation process from the anther to the stigma of the pollen grains is otherwise known as your pollination. So in this diagram, it is consist of two holes, that means your male reproductive hole and female reproductive hole. These are your male reproductive holes, this is your female reproductive hole. When the pollen grains are over here, that means it is your anther part. When the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma, that means over here, the transfer process, the simple transfer process of the pollen grains is otherwise known as your pollination. So here the definition: transfer of your pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. That means it is your anther part, this is your stigma part. The transformation takes place from the anther to the stigma. This simple process is otherwise known as your pollination. Hope it is clear to all of you. Nextly, the pollination process is again divided into two types. It is of two types. One is your self-pollination, another one is your cross-pollination. So in this particular session, we just discuss about your self-pollination. The definition of your self-pollination told you that when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, or same flower born on the same plant, is otherwise known as your self-pollination. I also wrote over here the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, from the anther to the stigma. That means the transformation process of the same flower. That means it occurs on the same flower or another flower born on the same plant. That means the flower is born on the same plant. It is otherwise known as your self-pollination. So when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther, this is your anther plant, anther to the stigma of the same flower, or anther to the stigma of another flower. That means if we take example, this is your flower number 1, this is your flower number 2, this is your flower number 3, this is your flower number 4. When the pollination takes place in number 3, that means your 3 number flower, from the anther to the stigma is otherwise known as your self-pollination. It also told you that when the pollen grains are transferred a single flower, that means from the anther to the stigma of another flower but born in a same plant, it transferred from the number 2 to number 4. That means number 2's anther is fall on number 4's stigma, but both are in your same plant, then it is known as your self-pollination. So we all clear a basic thing that when the self-pollination takes place, that means in this single part, that means in number 3, the anther is transferred from the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, and nextly from the anther to the another flower. The simple process is already known as your self-pollination, and the self-pollination is again divided into two types. One is your autogamy, another one is your heterogamy. So these two things are quite easier. That means you just split the term. Your auto means your self, and gamos means your marriage. That means I wrote over here, this is your autogamy, and autogamy means auto means your self and gamos means your marriage. When the marriage takes place in a same flower, that means the pollen grains are transferred in a single flower, then it is known as your autogamy. Transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. That means the flower is same, no change of flower takes place. That means when this is a single flower, when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, that means it is your same flower. Then it is known as your autogamy, and auto means your self and gamy means your marriage. Here the marriage, that means your pollination takes place in a single flower. There is no extra pollinators, there is no extra flowers are used. The pollination takes place in this flower also. That means the male part is over here and female part is in the same flower. Then it is known as your autogamy. Nextly, your geitonogamy. Geitonogamy means your neighboring. That means the transformation takes place in your neighboring plant, neighboring flower. That means it is your flower. You may take your 2, you may take your 3, you may take your 4. If we take example of your number 2, that means it is your male reproductive part. The pollen grains are transferred from the anther number 2, that means 2 numbers flower is going to deposit in your stigma of your number 4. That means 2 is neighbor to 4, and the transformation takes place for the anther of 2 number to the stigma of your 4 number. That means the neighboring flower of the same plant. The plant is not different, plant is same. When the pollen grains are transferred from the flower of your 2 number to the 4 number, then it is known as your geitonogamy. And your definition tells you that the transfer of the pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower born on the same plant. That means anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower born on the same plant. That means these flowers are born in a same plant and the pollination takes place. Here the pollination takes place in autogamy. We also saw that the pollination takes place in this flower also. That means the anther is in this flower and stigma is also in this flower. So this flower is also a bisexual flower. But in other things, on other ways, if I told you that the transformation takes place from the anther of a flower to the anther of a stigma of another flower, that means it is the neighboring flower, but the plant is your same, then it is known as your geitonogamy. Geitono means your neighbor. So when the pollination takes place from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower is otherwise known as your geitonogamy, but it takes place in your same flower, then it is known as your geitonogamy. In other ways, we also know that your pollination is also consist of a number of parts. We just discussed about, that means the simple process is otherwise known as your transformation process. That means the transfer takes place from the anther to the stigma, and it is of 2 types. One is your self-pollination, another one is your cross-pollination. Your self-pollination told you that when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, or transformation takes place from the same flower to the another flower born on the same plant, then it is known as your self-pollination. And again, self-pollination is split into 2 types. One is your autogamy, another one is your geitonogamy. Auto means your self, that means the pollination takes place in this flower, that means in a single flower. Self-pollination takes place. And autogamy, in this autogamy we also studied that it is also must be a bisexual flower. That means both the holes, male and female holes, are placed in a single, both the 2 holes are present in a single flower, so it is known as your bisexual flower. And nextly, the geitonogamy, that means the pollination takes place in your neighboring plant, neighboring flower, but in a single plant, then it is known as your geitonogamy. And we also I also told you that the pollination takes place a number of ways also. That means a number of pollinators are also, that means this technique is not a active process, it is a passive process. So a number of techniques are also used. That means a number of carriers are used to transfer of your pollen grains. That means your pollen grains transferred by the wind, your pollen grains are transferred by water medium also. A number of insects are also used, and we also know that very commonly a insect, your bee is transferred. I draw a diagram over here also. When the bee is transferred from, that means from the collection of a nectar, when the bee is transferred, fly over one flower to another flower, then the pollen grains are attached its leg and it just transfer from one flower to another flower. So in our cross pollination part we are going to discuss about that. So in our next session we are going to study about various types of controversies of your self pollination. Nextly we are going to study about your cross pollination. So till then, stay tuned. Thank you.